The night began like a confession whispered through smoke. Paris, wrapped in its usual damp melancholy, seemed to breathe unevenly beneath a thin veil of fog that clung to the bridges of the Seine. At a café facing the boulevard de Clichy, a single neon sign flickered, its dying light spilling across the wet cobblestones like blood diluted by rain. The patrons inside spoke in low murmurs, the kind that avoid names. Outside, a man in a heavy overcoat stood motionless, pipe unlit, collar raised, Maigret. His gaze, as steady as the grey current of the river, fixed on the police car parked across the street, where a body waited in silence. The girl had been found beneath that same neon sign, her perfume still faintly lingering in the air, mingling with the gasoline and the city's damp breath. It was not the kind of death that shocked Paris, but it was the kind that made Maigret think. He drew in the fog like tobacco, heavy and flavourless, and exhaled slowly. Murder was never what the papers said it was. It was smaller, quieter, born not of passion but of fatigue. And as the first light of morning touched the zinc rooftops, Maigret knew the case would lead him not into the alleys of Montmartre, but into the private corridors of human weariness, where guilt slept beside love, and the truth often hid behind kindness. And if you wish to follow him there, through the smoke, the rain, the murmurs, and the silent guilt of those who have too much to lose, then light your pipe, settle in, and let the case unfold. Subscribe, share, and stay with us till the end. Some truths are only visible when the city sleeps. The rain had been falling since midnight, soft but unrelenting, turning the gutters of Montmartre into slow-moving mirrors where the city lights bled and drifted like half-remembered dreams. The boulevard de Clichy lay under its usual haze, a mixture of fog, tobacco, and melancholy. Most of the cafés had closed their shutters, yet the neon sign above the Café des Deux Anges still sputtered defiantly, its blue glow quivering against the wet pavement. Beneath that glow, a shape lay half hidden by a parked car, the body of a girl who might have been sleeping if not for the stillness of her hands. When Maigret stepped out of the police car, his breath came out in faint clouds. He paused for a moment before lighting his pipe, letting the scene sink in. The faint hum of the sign, the reflection of its broken light in the puddles, the way the street seemed to hold its breath. A young constable stood nearby, cap damp, trying to look composed. "Found around 2, Chief," he murmured. "Barmaid from the café, they think. No papers on her. The patrons inside waiting." Maigret nodded but did not move immediately. He had that peculiar patience that made others uneasy, as though he were waiting for the street itself to confess. Finally he approached the body. She was young, no more than 20, dressed with the kind of care that came from necessity rather than vanity. Her coat was worn at the sleeves, her shoes still carried the dust of a long walk. One of her gloves had fallen into the gutter. He noticed the faint trace of perfume, something floral, faintly provincial, and the bruise along her jaw. No struggle marks, no handbag, just the soft, unexplainable peace that sometimes follows violence. He crouched beside her and touched the edge of her sleeve. The fabric was cold, heavy with rain. "Nothing on her?" he asked, without looking up. "Nothing, Chief. The patron says she left around 11. There was a quarrel, maybe. He's not sure." "Maybe," Maigret repeated softly. He stood up, his pipe unlit, eyes tracing the buildings. From an upper window, a woman's face withdrew quickly behind lace curtains. Somewhere, a cat mewed, startled by the flashing light of the police van. Maigret looked toward the café. Through the fogged glass, he could see the silhouettes of 2 men, one thin and nervous, the other leaning back with the indifference of someone who has already decided what not to say. Inside, the smell of beer and stale tobacco greeted him like an old acquaintance. The lights were still on, though dimmed, and the counter had been hastily wiped clean. A few chairs were upturned, as if the night had ended too suddenly. The patron, a heavy man in his 50s, with the kind of apron that never seemed quite white, was rubbing his hands with a towel that had long since given up being dry. "She was one of your girls?" Maigret asked, voice low. The man hesitated, eyes darting toward the door. "Yes, Chief Inspector, Odette. Worked evenings mostly. Quiet one. Came from Lille, I think. She'd been here about 6 months. Any trouble tonight?" A pause, the kind that grows heavy when truth and fear wrestle in silence. "A man was waiting for her," he finally said. "Tall fellow, foreign maybe. She seemed frightened when she saw him. They argued near the bar, but quietly. I thought it was nothing. Then she left." He followed soon after. Maigret drew in the faint smell of spilled cognac and looked around. On the counter stood a glass with the lip smudged by lipstick. He noticed the pattern of wet footprints leading toward the back door, and another set, heavier, overlapping them. The rain had already blurred their edges, but he could see the difference. Her steps light, hurried, his deliberate. "Did anyone hear what they said?" "No, Chief. The accordion was playing. Too loud, but she dropped her key when she left. I picked it up." The man reached into his pocket and handed Maigret a small brass key tied to a ribbon. Maigret turned it in his hand, noticing the faded blue thread. He slipped it into his pocket without comment. "Tell Lucas to check her lodgings," he said to the constable by the door. "And make sure the press stays outside. They'll smell blood by morning." He stepped back into the night, under the flickering sign that gave the scene its cruel poetry. The girl's body had already been covered, the stretcher men waiting for orders. The air carried that strange stillness of early dawn, when even the most ordinary street feels like a stage that has just witnessed something unspeakable. He looked up at the sign again, Café des Deux Anges, and thought, not without irony, how easily people named places after things they no longer believed in. A tram bell echoed somewhere in the distance. The city was waking, indifferent as ever. Maigret walked slowly toward the corner where the rain ran down the iron drain pipe in a steady trickle. He leaned against it, lit his pipe at last, and watched the smoke curl up, mingling with the fog. Behind him, Janvier approached with a clipboard. "She lived in a rooming house near Pigalle," Janvier reported. "Cheap place, mostly waitresses and dancers. Landlady says Odette came home every night after work, except tonight." "Any visitors?" "She mentioned someone from Nice last week, said she didn't want to see him. Landlady thought it was a lover." Maigret nodded absently. The word lover was as vague as friend or businessman. It covered everything and explained nothing. He took another draw from his pipe, the glow briefly illuminating his face. "We'll see," he said quietly. For a long time he stood there, staring at the spot where the body had been. The puddles had already begun to close over the memory of it, the water erasing traces faster than thought. He had seen this kind of scene 100 times before, yet something about it troubled him. Perhaps it was the stillness of her face, or the way the sign's dying light kept returning to life, only to fade again, like a heart refusing to stop. A car passed, splashing water across the street. A newspaper vendor across the boulevard began stacking his bundles for delivery. The first edition would carry the headline before sunrise: "Young woman found dead in Montmartre. Mystery, man sought." The city would devour it, as it devoured everything. Maigret watched the vendor through the mist. "Do you ever get used to it?" Janvier asked quietly. "No," Maigret said. "You just stop pretending to be surprised." He turned, glancing once more toward the café. The lights were out now, the sign still pulsing faintly. For a moment it illuminated the wet cobblestones and the empty spot where the girl had lain, then blinked, dimmed, and went dark. Maigret began walking toward the police car, his steps slow, measured, as if he were following an invisible trail. He felt the first pale grey of morning filtering through the fog, painting the zinc rooftops in a weary silver. Somewhere, a church bell rang 6 times. He thought of Madame Maigret, probably awake already, making coffee in their small kitchen by the boulevard Richard Lenoir. He took a final look back at the neon sign. It flickered once more, defiantly, before surrendering to the daylight. Beneath its silent glow, the story had begun, quietly, almost tenderly, as most murders do. Maigret tapped his pipe against the car door, climbed inside, and told the driver to head for the Quai des Orfèvres. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Paris had already closed over the scene like water, reclaiming a stone. By the time Maigret reached the Quai des Orfèvres, the river wore its habitual grey like a coat of fatigue, and the windows of the squad room shone with the pallor of early office light. A cleaning woman's bucket knocked softly against the skirting board. Somewhere down the corridor, a typewriter clacked, tentative at first, like a bird testing its wings before the day took flight. He took off his hat with a faint shake, as if casting off the last threads of the Montmartre fog, and hung his overcoat on the tall stand that had accompanied more confessions than any priest. The office smelled of damp wool, paper, and old tobacco, a smell that to Maigret meant order might yet be extracted from human muddle. He did not sit right away. The first letters of the morning were already on his desk. A circular from the prefecture, a note from the laboratory about a case of varnish, 2 envelopes with the prim caution of anonymous hands. He opened none of them. Instead, he stood at the window, pipe unlit, watching a barge move upriver with the obstinacy of things that know only one direction. The girl's glove in the gutter, the bruise on her jaw, the ribboned key in his pocket. These arranged themselves in his mind without haste, like chairs being set out before a meeting that everyone dreads but no one can avoid. Janvier entered without knocking, his hair still wet from the rain. "Lucas is at the rooming house," he reported. "He's taking an inventory with the landlady. There's talk of a cousin or an aunt, perhaps, in Lille. Her name at the lodgings is Odette Fournier." Maigret nodded as if to a fact that had been waiting to be acknowledged. Names settled him. They rescued the dead from anonymity. "Fournier," he repeated, letting the syllables sit a second in the air. "And the man?" "Nothing yet. The patron describes him as tall, dark coat, foreign in his manner of speaking, paid in cash, sat at the corner table by the cigarette machine. He took an Americano, then another, watched the door." "The corner table by the cigarette machine," Maigret murmured. He had seen the table. There had been a ring of moisture on it, 2 overlapping circles like careless wedding bands. "Have the laboratory collect the glasses, and send someone to the newspapers. No heroics. A line announcing a witness sought. No mention of the quarrel." Janvier understood. The press would inflate the violence for breakfast if given the chance. Better to feed them thin porridge than a roast. He lingered, as if reluctant to disturb a silence that had its own rhythm. "There's also this," he added, laying a small packet on the desk, a handkerchief folded with the compulsive precision of someone frightened to unfold it. "Found near the café entrance, caught under the mat, monogrammed L.R." Maigret did not touch it at once. He lit his pipe, watching the first curl of smoke rise as though his thoughts needed a visible form to move in. "LR," he said softly. It could be hers, it could be his. It could be neither. He lifted the cloth finally, pressed it between thumb and finger. The cotton held a faint scent that was not perfume, more like the after-smell of a wardrobe in a room where windows are rarely opened. When Lucas returns, have him circulate the monogram in the neighborhood. Quietly. No questions about politics, no gossip about foreigners, just the letters. And find out whether anyone in the building beside the café keeps late hours. A pianist, a seamstress, an insomniac, the night has eyes when people are alone. When Janvier had gone, Maigret sat down at last. He did not write, he simply let the weight of the chair take his shoulders, as if the wood itself understood the particular heaviness of certain cases. He remembered the neon, the slow pulse of it failing and returning like breath on a sick bed. He had known girls like Odette in 100 variations, a suitcase from a provincial station, a relative who was also a burden, a job that depended on the smile delivered with the tray. The city was kind to them only as long as they kept walking. If they stopped, even for an hour, even to cry, the city collected its due. A knock sounded. The duty sergeant, expression pinched by habit, held out a telegram on a tray as if it might bite. "From Nice, Chief," he said. "Arrived at the central office. Redirected here." Maigret took it, holding the cheap yellow paper by the corners. The message was brief, written in that stunted language telegrams forced on the living. "Arriving Paris today. Stop must speak with Odette Fournier. Urgent. Stop signed L. Raymond." He read it again, not because it was complex, but because of the space it opened in his mind like a window suddenly unlatched in a shut room. L. Raymond. He pictured the carefully folded handkerchief. He did not allow himself satisfaction. That feeling came too early, often enough, to make fools of good policemen. He rose, slipped the telegram into his pocket with the key, and took his coat again. "Tell Janvier to meet me at the Café des Deux Anges," he said to the sergeant, "and send a man to the Gare de Lyon and the Gare de l'Est, not to intercept, to watch. Our Mr. Raymond will not come through the river." The city outside was shaking off its damp sleep. Flower stalls along the quay were opening their awnings, the paper cones like bright, fragile promises against the sullen sky. Tram rails shone like wet fish spines. As Maigret crossed the Pont Saint-Michel, he thought of Madame Maigret placing cups on their kitchen table, the everyday rhythm of their life that formed the ballast to his days of weather and whispers. The pipe kept well, the tobacco cheered him not at all. Montmartre, in daylight, pretended innocence. The cafes folded back their shutters, revealing little altars to habit. The zinc counters, the glass jars of olives, the fading postcards pinned near the telephone. The Café des Deux Anges wore its morning face with an almost indecent brightness, as if night were a visitor it tolerated but did not know. The neon sign was off. The letters looked more honest unlit. Inside, a girl with a scarf tied too tightly at the throat scrubbed the counter with an energy not entirely devoted to cleanliness. The patron, seeing the overcoat, grew smaller behind his apron. "Chief Inspector," he said. He had slept, but badly. The skin under his eyes had the colour of old newsprint. "We opened a little late." "It's still early," Maigret replied. "Do you have a table free? The one by the cigarette machine?" He sat there, placed his hat on the neighbouring chair, as if for a companion expected. The room held the morning's statements of purpose, a man reading Le Petit Parisien, a woman stirring her coffee long after the sugar had vanished, an old soldier polishing his shoes with a napkin. All of them glanced toward the door when it opened. All of them returned to their rituals when it was only another customer and not the person their minds had prepared. Janvier arrived, shook off his coat, and ordered coffee without asking. "Lucas found a photograph in her room," he said. "It had been torn. You can still see part of a man's face, half a smile. The paper is the kind the street photographers use near the opera. He also found a theatre ticket. Odeon, balcony, last Tuesday." Maigret accepted the information without surprise. The torn photograph was a habit as old as mirrors. Lovers tore not to forget but to remain faithful to their anger. He allowed himself the smallest sigh. "And the landlady?" Convincing in her ignorance, she remembers Odette humming when she came up the stairs, says humming is the mark of girls pretending they are not tired. The door opened again. A man entered whose travelling coat had not learned the Paris rain. He was tall in that awkward way that makes doors seem smaller, his hat new, his shoes shiny with the care of someone who thinks cities judge by leather. He looked once around the room, saw the patron, and approached the counter with the slight stiffness of those who do not want to reveal they are lost. "Americano," he said, the vowels giving away a southern origin common to many places. He paid in coins that rang lightly against the zinc. He did not sit. He positioned himself at the corner table by the cigarette machine, as if that spot had been reserved by some previous agreement with fate. He did not see Maigret, or if he did, he filed him away with the lamps and the chairs. Janvier shifted in his seat. Maigret did not. Though the inspector's face was turned toward the window, indifferent to the café's small theatre. He let the man drink half his glass before he rose, fetched a match from the counter with the courtesy due a patron, and paused beside the stranger as if to light his own pipe. "Monsieur Raymond?" he asked, not unkindly. The man's eyes lifted. In them there was a flicker, not of guilt, not yet, but of calculation. "Yes," he said after the smallest of hesitations. "Louis Raymond." The lie, if it was one, did not emerge complete. It presented itself as a name wearing borrowed clothes. "You sent a telegram, arriving Paris today, must speak with Odette Fournier." Maigret laid the words on the table, a deck with only 2 cards. "She is dead." Raymond's hand closed around the Americano as if the glass might steady him. He did not drink. The café, which had been humming at its ordinary pitch, seemed to step backward, make room for the conversation. "Dead?" he repeated as men repeat bad weather. "When?" "After midnight," Maigret said. "Near this door." The man swallowed. "I came for her," he said, and the words had a sincerity that did not automatically qualify as truth. "I came to take her away from this place. She is... He stopped, the verb catching like a coat sleeve on a nail. "I should have come sooner." "From Nice?" Maigret inquired mildly. Raymond blinked, then nodded. "Your initials," Maigret continued, letting the smoke curl up between them, "are also on a handkerchief found at the threshold." Raymond's gaze moved involuntarily to the doormat. He recovered quickly, but the eyes had already travelled. "I lost it," he said. "Perhaps yesterday, or last week. I'm not sure." "People are seldom sure of things that matter," Maigret murmured. "Sit, monsieur. The coffee will not get warmer, and the questions won't get fewer." They took a table by the window. Janvier, by discreet migration, found himself near the door. The patron vanished into the back like a curtain pulled aside. "Tell me about Odette," Maigret said. "Tell me something not in the police registers. Tell me what her laugh was like. Did it make people kinder or crueler?" Raymond stared as if the question had been posed in a language he did not expect. "She laughed softly," he said finally. as if apologizing for being happy. She came to Nice last summer. She sold cigarettes near the casino for a time. We met at the promenade. She liked the sea at night when the lamps were lit. She said the water looked like glass breaking and being repaired at once. He paused, perhaps embarrassed by the poetry borrowed from a girl who was now a fact. "And you," Maigret said. "What did you do at night when the lamps were lit?" "I worked at the garage near the station," Raymond replied quickly, gripping the concrete. "I repaired engines for men who wanted to go very fast. Sometimes they went so fast they came back walking." "LR," Maigret said, softer. "Louis Raymond or Laurent." "Léon. Names are coats we put on. They keep the weather out. Sometimes they also keep the truth in." Raymond's jaw shifted. "Louis," he said. "Louis is enough." He looked not at Maigret but past him, to the place in the air where Odette might have been if grief obeyed invitations. "She wrote to me. She said Paris had teeth. She said she was tired. I sent her money for a ticket. She did not take it. Then yesterday, a telegram. 'Come if you mean it.' So I came." Maigret studied the face, not looking for villainy but for the traces of ordinary cowardice that make murderers of men who never intended to be. He saw fear, but not of the police. He saw pride wounded by delay. He saw a man who had hoped to arrive before the story became irreversible. "Did you see her last night?" he asked. Raymond shook his head. "I reached the city late. I walked," he added, as if this might cleanse him of some unnamed stain. "I found the café by asking. I was afraid to go in. I waited outside by the lamp. I saw a woman leave, not Odette, then a man. He stood in the rain. He did not look at me. I went away." "What time?" "I don't know, the kind of time that has no number." "Describe the man." "Tall," Raymond said, glancing instinctively to his own height, as if disqualifying himself. "He had the posture of someone who has worn a uniform too long." He smoked without pleasure. The door opened once more. This time the music of the street entered with a woman's perfume and the swift, self-contained stride of those who perform efficiency for a living. She was from the laboratory, her case at her wrist, her face invisible behind round spectacles that turned the world into evidence. She crossed to Maigret with the quiet authority of a nurse in a ward. "Chief," she said, low. We lifted a partial print from the lipstick glass, not enough to sing, enough to hum, and a second glass with residue of Americano and a cologne I can name in an hour. Also this, near the threshold. She opened the case and revealed a thin strip of torn paper, the kind used by cloakrooms. The number was half missing. In pencil, a scrawl. "Ah, Noli." Maigret did not look at Raymond when he asked, "Did you leave a coat last night, monsieur?" Raymond's face flushed, not with guilt, but with the anger of a man humiliated by practicality. "Yes," he said. "I left it at a cinema near Pigalle. I could not keep it dry." "Near Pigalle," Maigret repeated, filing away the geography of fear. "You will come to the quay with us now. You will tell this story again with the same hesitations and the same pride. If, in the telling, it changes, we will find out whether it is your memory or your conscience that failed you." Raymond stood. The café resumed its ordinary breathing. The girl at the counter resumed scrubbing a spot that had never been dirty. Outside the light had sharpened. The day had chosen its hardness. As they moved toward the door, Maigret paused, turned back to the patron. "Keep the table by the cigarette machine free," he said. "It is a good place for the truth to sit when it arrives late." On the pavement, the city gave them its familiar damp embrace. Janvier lifted his collar and walked a step ahead, a habit he had acquired on nights when drunk sometimes turned to fists. Raymond kept his eyes on the street, as if the cobblestones could absolve him by their endurance. Maigret, between them, felt the case settle a little, like a suitcase properly packed at last. He glanced once at the sky. It promised more rain by evening. He thought of the ribboned key in his pocket and of a door in a rooming house where a life had been kept in a small, careful space. He thought of the monogram that could belong to a woman, a man, or to a story neither of them had finished writing. When they reached the police car, he waited for the engine to catch, and while it warmed, he listened not to the motor but to a silence that felt, suddenly, expectant. They drove off, the river always somewhere to their right, the bridges like sober thoughts crossing the mind. As the Quai des Orfèvres came into view, Maigret let his eyes rest on the wet stone, on the windows that knew more secrets than any confessional. Behind them, Montmartre resumed its trade, honest or otherwise, and the neon at the Café des Deux Anges, though dark, held in its cold glass the memory of a pulse. The interrogation room would be warm, a lamp would hum, Janvier would pour coffee that tasted of tin. The first sentence spoken in such rooms often carried a man's whole life within it, if one knew how to listen. Maigret did know. He placed his hand on the door handle, felt the familiar give of the old metal, and for a second allowed himself the smallest, strangest feeling, that the case, while not yet ready to speak, had at least begun to breathe. By late afternoon, the clouds had lifted, leaving behind the washed, exhausted light peculiar to Paris after a long rain, a light that made even the most innocent corners seem guilty. The street outside the Café des Deux Anges was crowded again, carriages, vendors, and the occasional motor car pressed together in a restless harmony that belonged only to this part of Montmartre. Music leaked from a nearby cabaret, cheap and cheerful, pretending the night before had never happened. Yet the café itself seemed to resist the day, as though the walls remembered what the street wished to forget. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and vinegar. The brass counter had been polished to disguise wear, but the scratches still caught the light like old scars. A new waitress worked behind the bar, younger than Odette, nervous with the cups. Her hands trembled whenever a customer raised his voice. The patrons who had seen Maigret that morning now pretended they hadn't. They talked too loudly about the races at Longchamp, about the weather, about anything except the thing that had happened under the flickering sign. Maigret entered quietly, his presence folding into the room like a shadow joining its owner. His hat and overcoat hung heavy from the rain that had begun again. He nodded to Janvier, who sat at a corner table pretending to read a newspaper, and to the laboratory clerk who was already stationed near the back, disguised as a weary salesman. It was the kind of quiet arrangement Maigret preferred, no spectacle, only patience. The patron greeted him with the forced calm of a man who has spent the day waiting for news that never comes. "Chief Inspector," he said, polishing the same glass for the third time. "I didn't expect—" "No one expects me," Maigret interrupted softly, "but I come all the same." He sat near the stove, where the warmth softened the dampness of his coat. For a moment he simply watched. Two men at the bar played dominoes with solemn concentration. A woman in a green dress sipped her wine, eyes down, but Maigret noticed how she listened to every word around her. The pianist in the corner toyed with the same 3 notes, hesitant, as though afraid that playing a melody might awaken something best left sleeping. When the waiter approached, Maigret ordered nothing but coffee. He had learned long ago that in certain rooms, appetite was the quickest way to lose authority. The cup arrived chipped, half full, and he left it untouched. His gaze wandered to the mirror behind the bar, where the whole café repeated itself. but reversed, slightly distorted, as if the mirror knew the truth of each face and chose to lie politely. A door creaked open in the back. From the narrow passage emerged a man in a pale suit, carrying himself with the swagger of someone accustomed to applause. His hair was carefully slicked back, his expression vaguely theatrical. He nodded to the patron, then turned toward the pianist. "Play something livelier, for God's sake," he said, tossing a coin onto the lid of the piano. "You'll have the place in mourning." The pianist obeyed with a weak smile, launching into a tune that tried too hard. The man in the suit, Maigret already recognized the type, sat at the center table, spreading his arms across the chair as if claiming the room. He smelled faintly of pomade and failure. Maigret rose and approached him, slow and deliberate. "You're a regular here," he said, not asking, but stating. The man looked up, wary amusement in his eyes. "Sometimes. Depends who's playing." "You knew Odette Fournier." The amusement vanished. "I knew her," he said after a moment. "Everyone here knew her. She served the drinks." "You quarrelled with her last night." "I wouldn't call it a quarrel." "What would you call it?" The man's smile flickered back, brittle as glass. "A misunderstanding. Between friends." Maigret didn't sit. "Friends don't follow each other into the rain to continue misunderstandings." The pianist missed a note. The woman in the green dress stopped stirring her wine. The café's attention, though pretending to wander, had quietly arranged itself around them. The man shrugged. "You're making more of it than there was. I had been drinking. She didn't want to talk. That's all." "What was her last word to you?" The man hesitated, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "She said she was tired. I thought she meant me. Maybe she meant everything." Maigret let the silence between them stretch until it became uncomfortable. "Your name?" "Henri Leclerc," the man said too quickly. "Profession?" "Pianist. At the cabaret down the street. Sometimes here." Maigret's eyes shifted toward the real pianist, whose fingers trembled on the keys. "I see." "She was kind," Leclerc added suddenly, voice lower now. "Too kind. That's what happens to girls like her. They think kindness is armor. Did you love her?" The man's smile faltered completely. "Don't make me sentimental, Chief Inspector. We're all too poor for love." "Yet she wrote to someone in Nice," Maigret said quietly. "Someone named Louis Raymond." Leclerc's reaction was small but unmistakable. The faint tightening of a jaw, the shallow breath that comes before a lie. "Never heard of him," he said. "I believe you have," Maigret replied evenly. "He arrived this morning. He's at the Quai des Orfèvres now." For the first time, Leclerc looked truly afraid. Not of arrest, but of something older, more private. The fear of being remembered by someone you'd tried to forget. "He came," he whispered. "After all this time?" "Tell me, Monsieur Leclerc, why does his name trouble you?" Leclerc ran a hand over his face. "Because she never stopped waiting for him," he said finally. "Even when she laughed, even when she served drinks, she was waiting. I could see it every night, the way she turned toward the door whenever it opened, the kind of waiting that becomes a sickness." "And you resented it?" "I pitied it." "Pity," Maigret murmured, "is often what men feel before cruelty." Leclerc's hands clenched. "I didn't kill her." "I haven't said you did." "But you think it." "I think many things. They change as easily as the weather." Maigret turned to leave, but paused. "Where were you between 11 and midnight?" "Here, playing. Ask anyone." "I will," Maigret said. "And if they all tell me the same story, I'll still ask again tomorrow." He walked back toward the door, the murmur of the café swelling behind him like the return of breath after a long silence. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of iron and wet stone. He lit his pipe and leaned against the lamp-post. Janvier joined him, tucking his notebook into his pocket. "He's nervous," Janvier said. "They all are," Maigret replied. "Guilt is not a proof, Janvier. It's a language. You have to learn its accent." Janvier nodded, glancing through the window. The lab report came in. The fingerprints on the glass at the café match neither Odette nor Leclerc. They're partial, but they belong to someone who's handled machinery. Oil residue. Maigret thought of the telegram from Nice, of Raymond's work in a garage. "Machinery," he repeated. "Engines, the hands of a man who repairs what others break." He exhaled a slow cloud of smoke, watching it fade against the pale evening. Somewhere across the river, church bells began to ring, not in celebration, not in grief, but in that steady rhythm that reminded Parisians the world went on regardless of their tragedies. "Send Lucas to the railway locker again," Maigret said. "Have him check for another key, perhaps one that fits what we don't yet know we've lost." Janvier nodded and hurried off, his boots splashing through shallow puddles. Maigret remained where he was, eyes fixed on the faint reflection of the neon sign that had begun flickering again as dusk returned. It buzzed weakly, uncertain whether to live or die. And he thought of Odette, a girl whose life had been one long flicker in a city that never stayed dark enough to rest. He drew on his pipe, the glow briefly warming his face. Somewhere behind him, the pianist began again, slower this time, the melody fragile but determined. Maigret listened for a while, then turned toward the river, his steps echoing softly against the stones. The night would bring more questions, and perhaps, if one listened closely enough, one answer trying to be heard. The investigation, like the flickering neon, refused to fade. By the time Maigret returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, the fog had rolled back from the river, leaving the Seine glassy and indifferent beneath the street lamps. The day's rain had settled into the stones. Even the footsteps of passers-by seemed muffled, cautious. The city had folded in upon itself, preparing for another night of secrets. Inside the building, warmth gathered thickly in the corridors. Stale coffee, ink, and the faint perfume of paper, soaked in tobacco. Maigret moved through it as though through his own thoughts. Slowly, purposefully, unwilling to disturb the silence that followed him like a shadow. In the interrogation room, Louis Raymond sat with his hands folded neatly on the table. His coat was draped over the chair beside him, still damp, and the collar had lost its shape. There was something fragile about the way he sat. Not nervous, not yet resigned, but caught between two instincts, to speak or to vanish. The lamp above the table hummed faintly, throwing his face into a pale half-light. Maigret, watching from the doorway, thought of the telegram, its clipped urgency, its absence of tenderness. Must speak with Odette Fournier. Urgent. He wondered how many lives had unraveled because someone used the word urgent too late. He entered without ceremony, placing his hat on the table with deliberate softness. "You been comfortable enough?" he asked. Raymond gave a small nod. "I've had worse nights." "I'm sure you have." Maigret sat opposite him, his pipe between his fingers, but unlit. "You said you came from Nice. You said you arrived yesterday. Tell me again, slowly this time." Raymond's eyes drifted toward the wall, where the plaster bore the faint outline of stains from other stories. "I took the train from Nice in the morning. Arrived in Paris around 9 in the evening. I didn't go straight to see her. I needed to think." "To think about what?" He hesitated. About whether I should see her at all. It had been a long time. How long? A year, a little more. And what separated you? The usual things, Raymond said with a thin smile. Money, distance, pride. She wanted to stay. I wanted to leave. In the end, we both did what we were good at. We misunderstood each other. Maigret leaned back. And yet you sent a telegram. She asked me to. When? A week ago. She said she needed help. She said there was someone who frightened her. Who? I don't know. She didn't give a name. Maigret struck a match and lit his pipe. The flame trembled briefly, then steadied. You see, he said, through the first exhaled curl of smoke, that's the part I don't quite believe. People who are afraid don't send telegrams to old lovers unless they have no one else left. And if she had no one else, she wouldn't have waited for you in a place like Montmartre. It's not the sort of neighborhood that keeps promises. Raymond's jaw tightened. I didn't ask her to live there. No, Maigret said quietly. But you didn't stop her either. The man's eyes flicked toward the door, where the sound of a typewriter echoed faintly from the hall. You think I killed her. I think you came to Paris with more than nostalgia. I think you arrived tired, perhaps angry, perhaps guilty. You waited outside the café. You saw her with another man, Leclerc, the pianist. You followed her when she left. There was rain, words exchanged. A blow, maybe accidental, maybe not. Raymond's voice cracked before he could steady it. No. Maigret didn't press. He knew the rhythm of guilt. It rose and fell like a tide. To speak too soon was to scatter it. He let the silence stretch until it became a presence in the room. Finally, Raymond said, I waited outside, it's true. But she never came out. I thought maybe she'd gone another way. I walked. I ended up near the canal. I don't even remember how I got there. You remember enough to know you didn't go back. I couldn't. I thought she didn't want to see me. Maigret nodded, slightly, as though granting him that small mercy. And this someone she feared? What did she say about him? She said he knew things about her, that he could ruin her. What kind of things? I don't know. His hands trembled faintly on the table. I thought she meant debts, or a man from before. Maigret studied him. A man like you. Raymond met his gaze then, and there was something almost pleading in it. No, Chief Inspector, worse. For a moment, neither spoke. The hum of the lamp filled the room like a low, insistent question. Maigret drew on his pipe, eyes half closed. You were seen, he said finally. A flower vendor near the café remembered you. She said you waited under the awning for nearly an hour, smoking. She saw you walk toward the alley just before midnight. Raymond shook his head slowly. Then she's mistaken. I was near Pigalle. I remember a cinema, a film I didn't watch. What film? He hesitated too long. Something American? I don't know. Maigret exhaled a thin stream of smoke. Perhaps we'll ask the cinema owner. He'll remember if you were there. Raymond's face paled. You think I'm lying? I think you're forgetting, Maigret said gently. Forgetting is just lying to yourself in slow motion. He rose, gathered his hat, and left the room without looking back. Janvier was waiting in the hallway, his notebook closed, the smell of cheap coffee following him like an aura. Lucas found the other half of the photograph, Janvier said. It was hidden behind the drawer in her room. The man beside her isn't Raymond. Maigret stopped. Describe him. Shorter, older, balding, well-dressed. Could be anyone. But the background, it's not Paris. There's a train behind them. You can read the sign. Saint-Quentin. The name hung between them like a small, unexpected door. Maigret nodded slowly. "Send a telegram," he said, "to the station master at Saint-Quentin. Ask for any records of Odette Fournier, or a man travelling under the name Leclerc." He walked back toward his office, the soles of his shoes whispering against the corridor floor. The telegrams, they were multiplying now, thin paper threads connecting cities, lies, and ghosts. Every time he thought he had reached the edge of the story, another message appeared, as if the dead girl were still sending him clues from somewhere just beyond the reach of comprehension. In his office, he sat heavily, pipes still between his fingers. The fog outside had thickened again, wrapping the street in its soft grey anonymity. Across the room, the radiator ticked faintly. He reached for the telephone, then stopped. A memory surfaced. The widow, near the Canal Saint-Martin, her claim that she had seen the girl alive after midnight. He had almost dismissed her as lonely. But loneliness, he thought, was a kind of clairvoyance. People who lived alone noticed what others ignored. He rose again, put on his hat, and stepped back into the night. The rain had returned, fine and cold, almost invisible. It traced the edges of his overcoat, clung to his eyelashes. The streets of Paris gleamed faintly, like wet postcards from another life. As he crossed the bridge toward the northern quarter, he thought of Odette. Her final hours refracted through the city like light through smoke. Somewhere, he was certain, another telegram waited to be sent, another shadow preparing to answer. At the corner of the Quai Valmy, a newspaper kiosk was still open. The headlines shouted, "Police pursue, lovers quarrel theory, in Montmartre murder." Maigret stopped beneath the awning, read it once, and felt a kind of quiet contempt. The press always preferred simplicity. A murder explained by love, a victim explained by beauty. It was neater that way, but life, he thought, was messier. Love seldom killed anyone, disappointment did. He continued walking until the lights of the city blurred into the fog. Ahead, a single window burned in the upper floor of a narrow building, the widow's apartment. Somewhere above, the truth was waiting, wrapped in the kind of silence that only those who live alone can bear. He pressed the bell once, heard it echo weakly inside. A shadow moved beyond the curtain, hesitant, deliberate. The door opened. "Madame," Maigret said softly, "you told me you saw her last night. I need you to tell me again, but this time, tell me what you were afraid to say." The woman's eyes flickered, uncertain, and for a moment Maigret thought he saw the reflection of the café's flickering neon still glowing faintly in her pupils. The past, it seemed, never really turned off. The stairway was narrow, its walls the colour of smoke, and each step complained softly beneath Maigret's weight. The smell of boiled cabbage lingered in the air, the unmistakable perfume of small Parisian buildings where privacy was as thin as the wallpaper. On the third landing, a cat darted across his path, its tail brushing his trouser leg before vanishing into a dark recess. He heard the faint clatter of dishes behind a door, a cough from another, and then silence again. When he reached the widow's flat, she was waiting in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl, her face half lit by the lamp she held. "Chief Inspector," she said, her voice hesitant but not surprised. "I knew you'd be back. They never come just once." Maigret removed his hat, nodding slightly. "May I come in?" She stepped aside and he entered. The room was small but tidy, the kind of order that comes from loneliness rather than pride. The curtains were drawn, though it was barely evening. The lamp's light trembled across old photographs, a crucifix, a teapot with a chipped handle. On the table lay a newspaper folded neatly beside a pair of spectacles. A pot simmered faintly on the stove, releasing the smell of onion and something sour, like regret left too long uncovered. "Sit, Chief," she said, setting the lamp down. "I don't get many visitors." Maigret settled into the chair she indicated. He noticed that every object in the room seemed to have a story it had told too many times. The worn cushion, the clock with a stopped hand, the lace doily mended 3 times over. The widow herself looked as if she had been carved from the same fabric as her furniture, pale, enduring, and quietly expectant. "You said last night that you saw the girl," he began. She nodded, clasping her hands together. "Yes, I did. Around 11:30. I'd gone to close the shutters. The rain had started again, and I looked out. My window faces the canal, you know. I saw her walking on the opposite pavement. She had no umbrella, poor child. Her coat was open and she was carrying something in her arms. I thought it might be flowers, but now I think it was a parcel." "Did she seem frightened?" The widow hesitated. "No, not frightened. Tired, perhaps, like someone who's finished something and has nothing left to do." She stopped under the lamp-post for a long while. Then a man joined her. Maigret leaned forward. "A man? Can you describe him?" "I can try. He wore a hat, pulled low, a dark coat. I couldn't see his face, but I remember the way he stood, very straight, like someone used to being obeyed." They talked for a minute, maybe 2. Then she handed him the parcel. He didn't take it at first. She insisted. I saw her gesture. Like this. She mimed the motion of pressing something forward, palms open. He finally took it, and they walked off together toward the bridge. Maigret nodded slowly, the image forming in his mind. "And that was the last you saw of her?" "Yes. I went to bed not long after, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the rain on the window. And once, perhaps 20 minutes later, I thought I heard a cry. Not loud, just sharp, sudden, like someone being startled. I got up, looked out again, but the street was empty." He let her words settle, as one lets dust show its pattern in a beam of light. "You didn't mention the parcel before." She looked down, ashamed. "No, I didn't. I was afraid you'd think I was inventing things. People always do when someone old says too much." Maigret smiled faintly. "Old people notice what others forget to see. What colour was the paper?" "Brown, tied with string." "And how large?" She gestured, roughly the size of a book. "Like something you could hide under a coat." He took out his notebook, but didn't write. "You've done well to remember, madame. One more thing. Did you see where the man came from?" "No," she said softly. "But he didn't come from the café. He came from the other side, near the bridge." He stood, the floor creaking beneath his boots. "You've been very helpful. If you recall, hey, anything else, anything at all, send word to the Quai des Orfèvres." She hesitated. "Chief Inspector." "Yes." "Do you think he killed her?" Maigret looked at her for a long moment, the lamplight glinting off his eyes. "I think," he said slowly, "that when 2 people meet under the rain at that hour, it's because something between them has already died." She crossed herself, murmuring something too quiet to hear. Maigret put on his hat and stepped out into the corridor. The air was cold and heavy, smelling faintly of damp plaster. As he descended the stairs, his mind replayed the widow's words, the parcel, the man's posture, the gesture of insistence. Each detail was like a small stone dropped into still water, ripples widening toward the unknown. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and glimmering under the gaslights. He paused near the canal, watching the reflection of the bridges tremble in the dark water. The sound of an accordion drifted from a distant café, not joyful, not mournful, but something in between. He thought of the parcel. A letter, perhaps? A keepsake? Or evidence? Something worth meeting for, even in the rain. He reached into his pocket and felt the small brass key again, the one with the blue ribbon. He turned it between his fingers. If it belonged to Odette's room, what then? What if it opened something else? A locker? A drawer? A memory? Janvier found him there 10 minutes later, collar turned up, cigarette glowing faintly in the mist. "You're getting soaked, Chief," he said. "You should come back. Lucas wired from Saint-Quentin." Maigret looked up. "And?" "They found her name in the registry of a small boarding house near the station. Stayed there a year ago for 2 weeks. Registered with another person. Male. No address given. The landlady remembers the name Leclerc." Maigret's expression didn't change, but the pipe in his hand stopped moving. "So," he murmured, "our pianist travels." "And something else," Janvier added, handing him a folded telegram. "The station master says a package addressed to Mademoiselle Fournier was sent from Saint-Quentin 3 days ago. No sender listed. It's being held at the post office." The rain began again, softly, like the city whispering to itself. Maigret tucked the telegram into his coat pocket. "We'll go there tomorrow," he said. "Tell Lucas to meet us on the morning train." As they walked along the canal, their footsteps echoing in the stillness, Maigret couldn't shake the image of the widow's lamplit face, that frail, trembling courage of those who remember what they wish they hadn't seen. In his mind, the scene repeated. The girl under the lamp-post, the parcel, the man's stiff posture, the gesture of surrender. Somewhere in that small, ordinary movement, the entire mystery was folded. When they reached the car, Janvier climbed in first. Maigret stood for a moment longer beneath the bridge, pipe glowing faintly. He watched the current slide by, slow and merciless, carrying with it the lights of the city and the faces of those it forgot. He murmured to himself, almost absently, "It's never the shadow that kills Janvier. It's what it hides." The car door closed, and the sound was swallowed by the fog. The morning broke pale and uncertain, a thin mist clinging to the rooftops, as if Paris were trying to remember itself after too many bad dreams. The trains at Gare du Nord sighed and groaned, their iron lungs exhaling clouds of steam that smelled faintly of coal and rain. Maigret stood on the platform with his collar turned up, a heavy suitcase of fatigue under his eyes. He had not slept. Somewhere in the city, a milk cart rattled, and a newsboy called headlines about the Montmartre murder, mispronouncing her name with cheerful indifference. The inspector didn't bother correcting the world anymore. He simply endured it. Janvier was already waiting near the station entrance, holding a small parcel wrapped in newspaper. "Lucas found it," he said as Maigret approached. "Locker 17, second level. Key fits perfectly." Maigret took the parcel and turned it in his hands. It was light. Too light for anything dangerous, yet handled with the caution reserved for things that matter. He peeled back the newspaper, exposing the brown wrapping beneath, tied neatly with the same kind of twine the widow had described. His fingers paused at the knot. Where exactly was it hidden? In a corner locker, rented 2 days before the murder under the name O. Fournier, paid cash. And who saw her? The attendant said she looked tired, kept glancing over her shoulder. He thought she was waiting for someone. Maigret nodded absently, eyes fixed on the parcel. "They're all waiting for someone, Janvier. That's the tragedy of cities like this. Too many platforms, not enough arrivals." He untied the string carefully, flattening each fold as though opening a wound with respect. Inside, between layers of tissue paper, was a letter and a photograph. The letter was short, written in a hurried hand. Odette, it read. I can't come back to Paris. Not now. Too dangerous. Keep it safe. Burn this after reading. If they ask, you never saw me. Ah, the photograph beneath showed a group of people standing in front of a small hotel. The sign above the door read, Hôtel des Voyageurs, Saint-Quentin. At the centre of the group stood Odette, smiling faintly, beside a man whose face was turned half away. But Maigret knew that stance, that rigid posture. The widow had described it perfectly. He was the man under the lamp-post. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, a note, R. Leclerc, July 1931. Janvier whistled softly. So our pianist used to be someone else. People change names as easily as they change jackets, Maigret said, slipping the letter and photograph back into the paper. The difference is that old names leave stains like sweat on a collar. They never quite wash out. They walked together toward the main concourse where the air smelled of metal, damp wool, and impatience. Porters shouted, luggage wheels rattled, and the great station clock ticked with the slow indifference of institutions. Maigret's mind moved through the facts without haste. The telegrams, the handkerchief, the parcel, the widow's story, the false pianist. Everything was beginning to touch, if not yet to fit. "Have you traced Leclerc's past?" Maigret asked. Not completely. He was registered in Saint-Quentin 2 years ago under the name René Leclerc. Worked briefly at a local garage until there was an accident. What kind of accident? Janvier hesitated. Explosion. 1 man killed. Police reports said it was an accident, but there were whispers. Smuggling, maybe. The dead man was an accountant for a transport company. No charges were filed. Leclerc left town the next week. Disappeared into music, Maigret murmured, and Odette followed later. He looked toward the departing trains, their lights receding into the fog like half-kept promises. "We'll take the next to Saint-Quentin. I want to see that hotel." Janvier blinked. "Today?" "Today," Maigret said, "before the trail grows colder than she already is." They boarded the 9:15, the car half empty, except for a few businessmen, a priest, and a mother nursing a child. The countryside slid past in muted greens and browns, the fields swollen with last night's rain. Maigret sat by the window, pipe in hand but unlit, watching the reflections of the passengers blur against the glass. The rhythm of the train soothed him into thought. Each case, he reflected, had its own temperature, some hot and violent, others cold and patient. This one was damp, heavy, like a cellar where air never moved. At Saint-Quentin, the wind carried the faint tang of factory smoke. The Hôtel des Voyageurs stood across from the station, small and grey, with curtains the colour of neglect. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of furniture polish and cabbage soup. The proprietress, a woman with hair pulled so tightly it seemed to hold her face in place, looked up from the desk. "Police," Maigret said simply, showing his card. "You remember Odette Fournier?" The woman squinted. "Fournier? The pretty one, with the sad eyes?" "Yes, I remember. Stayed with Monsieur Leclerc. They said they were cousins. You learn not to ask too much." "Did they quarrel?" She shrugged. "Not loudly, but you could feel it. She cried one night. I heard through the floor. Then one morning she was gone. He left the next day." Maigret took out the photograph and laid it on the counter. "Recognize this?" Her lips pressed thin. "That's them. But the others—" "I don't know. They stayed only one night. One of them had a car, an American one, loud. They said they were driving south." He studied her face as she spoke, noting the slight tremor in her voice when she mentioned the car. "Was there ever any trouble here, madame? Police, perhaps?" She looked away. "Not here. But after they left, the gendarmes came. They asked about the explosion. Everyone knew it wasn't an accident. Maigret nodded slowly. Thank you. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of rain over the canal. He and Janvier stood beneath the awning, the photograph between them. She was running, Janvier said. From him, from the past, from both. Running never works, Maigret replied. The past always knows the way. They took the afternoon train back to Paris, the countryside now darker, sullen beneath low clouds. Maigret's thoughts were heavy but clear. The photograph had changed everything. Odette and Leclerc were bound not by love but by secrecy. Raymond from Nice had been the distraction, the innocent drawn into a story too large for him. At the Quai des Orfèvres, dusk had already gathered when they arrived. The city was turning on its lights, a slow awakening after another day of forgetting. Maigret's office felt close, the radiator humming, the air thick with smoke. Lucas sat waiting, a folder open before him. "Report from the lab," he said. "The handkerchief. Trace of machine oil and wax. Same residue as the photograph paper. And Chief—" He hesitated. They found fingerprints on the letter, 2 sets, Odette's and Leclerc's. Maigret leaned against the desk, silent for a long time. Then he came back, he said finally. Or she sent it to him first. Either way, that parcel was never meant to reach anyone else. He picked up the letter again, the one signed simply R. There was no tenderness in it, only fear. He thought of the widow's window, the lamplight trembling over her shawl, the man's straight posture under the rain. Fear made people stand straight, he realized. It gave them dignity right before it destroyed them. He moved to the window and looked out over the river. The lights of Paris shimmered faintly on the surface, as though the city itself were undecided about what it reflected, innocence or guilt. "We'll bring him in tonight," he said quietly. "Leclerc won't sleep well knowing she kept that letter." Janvier nodded. "Do you think he killed her, Chief?" Maigret's pipe smoke curled into the air, slow and uncertain. "I think," he said, "she died trying to protect someone who didn't deserve it. And I think whoever killed her didn't mean to. Not until he realized what she'd kept." The office fell silent, except for the ticking of the radiator and the distant hum of the river beyond the window. Maigret felt the weight of the photograph in his pocket, a fragment of a story still incomplete. Somewhere, a piano began to play faintly, perhaps from a bar across the river. The same tune, he thought, she must have heard that final night. And in that melody, hesitant, half-remembered, he heard the echo of her last steps, soft against the wet pavement of Montmartre, moving toward a meeting that had never been meant to happen. The next morning arrived grey and restless, the kind of dawn that looked older than the day it belonged to. The Seine moved slowly beneath the bridges, a thick ribbon of cold steel water that reflected no colour, only a kind of sullen resignation. Paris was half awake, half dreaming, its markets clattering open, its cafés exhaling their first curls of steam. And above it all, in the damp chill of the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret smoked at his window like a man waiting for the city to confess. Behind him the office ticked with small sounds, Janvier shuffling reports, Lucas telephoning the ministry, the endless scratching of pens. The papers were thick with the case now, the girl beneath the neon, a police mystery. Another headline called it the Montmartre melodrama. They'd given Odette Fournier the immortality Paris reserved for its dead girls, a few inches of print and a photograph stolen from a friend's dresser. Maigret had seen it before, too often, the slow transformation from human being to story. It disgusted him, not because of the lies, but because of how easily people preferred them. He turned as Janvier entered, carrying 2 telegrams. One from Saint-Quentin-Chief, one from Nice. Maigret took the first. Garage fire confirmed suspicious. Deceased identified as Henri Laval, accountant. Associate Leclerc and Fournier disappeared following incident. The second was shorter. Louis Raymond, known to local police. Questioned 2 years ago in smuggling case. Released, no conviction. He folded both without comment. So they were all tangled in it, he said quietly. The garage, the explosion, the girl. They carried the ashes with them to Paris. Lucas appeared at the door. Leclerc's gone, Chief. His room at the cabaret was cleared out last night. Maigret did not move. Gone where? No one knows. The pianist says he took the evening train to Rouen, or maybe to Le Havre. Depends who you ask. The inspector walked to his desk and set his pipe carefully on the ashtray. When men vanish, Lucas, they don't go to the sea unless they've already decided to drown. Check the timetables. If he took the last train west, we'll have the station notified. Lucas nodded and left. Janvier lingered, watching Maigret's face as though trying to read it. You think he'll run far? Far enough to convince himself he's safe, Maigret said. Men like Leclerc never believe they can be caught. They only believe the past is somewhere behind them, limping too slowly to catch up. But the past doesn't limp, Janvier. It waits. He looked again toward the river. The mist had thickened, and through it he could just make out the shadow of a barge sliding beneath the pont Neuf. Silent, patient, inevitable. Come, he said suddenly. We'll walk. They left the building without hurry, stepping into the morning that smelled of wet stone and roasting chestnuts. Across the embankment, the stalls of the bouquinistes were opening, their shutters creaking like old bones. Books lay in neat, damp stacks, their spines swollen with age. Maigret paused at one of them, picking up a volume at random. Balzac, La Cousine Bette. He thumbed through it absently, then replaced it. You know, he said, Balzac understood murder better than most detectives. He knew it was just another form of desperation. They crossed the bridge toward the left bank. At the corner, an old news vendor tipped his cap. Morning, Chief Inspector. Terrible business, that Montmartre girl. They say the murderer was a jealous lover. They always say that, Maigret replied mildly. It's easier than saying she died for something no one understands. The vendor chuckled nervously and looked away. But another man, young, wearing a student's coat and spectacles too large for his face, leaned in. I heard she was mixed up with smugglers, he said. Something about stolen papers, maybe espionage. Everyone's talking about it at the cafes. Everyone? Maigret asked. The student nodded eagerly. At the Café Voltaire, near the Sorbonne. They say the police are covering it up, that she was carrying a letter for a government man. Maigret's expression didn't change. Ah, he said, and who told them that? The student hesitated. A journalist, I think, from Le Matin. He said he had proof. Maigret thanked him, slipped a coin onto the table, and continued walking. When they were out of earshot, Janvier frowned. Should we check it? Of course, not the proof, the journalist. By the time they reached the Café Voltaire, the sun had begun to fight its way through the haze. The place was already crowded with smoke and chatter, the air thick with philosophy and cheap tobacco. At the back, beneath a poster for Les Misérables, a thin man sat writing rapidly in a notebook, a café crème untouched beside him. Maigret recognized him at once, Deltour, the crime reporter, who turned rumor into currency. He was the kind of man who knew everything except the truth. Delcourt, Maigret said, setting his hat on the table. You seem to be solving my case without me." The journalist looked up, startled, then smiled thinly. "Chief Inspector, I was just gathering impressions. The public has an appetite, you know." "Yes," Maigret said, "and like all appetites, it doesn't care what it eats." "What's this talk about espionage?" Delcourt's smile widened. "A story, that's all. Someone mentioned the girl had a parcel. Someone else said it went missing. Add a few whispers about a politician from the Ministry of Transport, and voila, front page." Maigret studied him. "You don't believe it yourself?" Delcourt shrugged. "Belief doesn't sell papers." "Neither does contempt," Maigret said. "Careful you don't choke on your own ink." He rose without another word, leaving the journalist blinking at his reflection in the coffee. Outside, the noise of the street swallowed them again. Trams, horns, the clatter of a horse cart. Janvier walked beside him in silence until Maigret spoke. "Do you remember the handkerchief?" he asked. "The one with the monogram?" "Yes. I had it tested again this morning. The wax on it, it's from sealing sticks, the kind used on letters. And there was a trace of blue dye, the same kind found on telegram paper." Janvier looked puzzled. "So, she sent something?" "She was sending something, or someone stopped her from doing it." "That's what the parcel was, a letter, a confession, maybe proof from the explosion in Saint-Quentin. Whatever it was, Leclerc wanted it destroyed." "And the man under the lamppost?" Janvier asked quietly. Maigret stopped walking. The Seine moved beneath them, slow and opaque. "That," he said, "is what we'll find tonight." They returned to the quay as the afternoon began to fade. Lucas was waiting with a report. "Leclerc didn't take the train to Rouen after all," he said. "He bought a ticket but never boarded. We found his suitcase in the cloakroom at Gare Saint-Lazare. Inside, a change of clothes, a passport under another name, and a theatre ticket." "A theatre ticket," Maigret repeated softly. "Odeon?" "Yes, Chief. Balcony, last Tuesday, the same night as the ticket found in Odette's room." Maigret nodded slowly. "Then that's where it began, or ended." He looked at the photograph once more, the faces in front of the hotel, the frozen smiles. Beneath the gaslight of his office, they seemed to shift slightly, as though the figures might step out if only the right question were asked. He tapped the edge of the photo against his pipe. "We'll go to the Odéon," he said, quietly, before the actors take their bow. When they stepped out again, night was gathering over the river. The mist had returned, turning the lamps into blurred halos. Somewhere a piano was playing, not a cabaret tune this time, but something slower, sadder. Maigret listened as they walked, the melody following them like memory. He thought of the students' rumours, the journalists' lies, the widow's trembling truth. In the end, all stories flowed toward the same place. The river, wide and silent, waiting to receive what people could no longer bear to remember. He looked out over its surface, dark and patient beneath the bridges, and murmured, half to himself, "If Paris has a conscience, Janvier, it's the Seine. It hears everything. It just never repeats it." They crossed the bridge, their footsteps fading into the mist, toward the theatre whose lights still burned. Bright, defiant, and flickering, like the last truth left in a city built on rumour. The Hôtel Saint-Denis stood in a narrow street behind the Odéon, half hidden between a shuttered bakery and a shop that sold umbrellas no one ever seemed to buy. The façade was the colour of a forgotten newspaper, and the sign above the entrance swayed faintly with every passing omnibus. Inside, the air smelled of polish and damp linen, the unmistakable odour of small hotels where nights are long and memories short. Maigret paused in the vestibule, pipe unlit, his eyes adjusting to the dimness. A small clerk, more dust than man, appeared behind the counter, startled at the sight of authority. "Police," Maigret said, showing his card. "I'd like to see the register." The clerk fumbled with a key, produced a heavy ledger, and opened it on the counter. "We run a respectable place, Chief Inspector," he murmured, his voice full of the defensiveness of the innocent. "Mostly travelling salesmen, and one or two actresses sometimes." "I'm sure," Maigret replied evenly. His finger traced down the neat columns of ink. There it was. Odette Fournier entered on the Tuesday before her death. The signature beside hers, R. Leclerc. The room number, 17, paid for one night only. "When did they leave?" he asked. The clerk hesitated. "The man left before dawn. The woman stayed a little longer. She came down around 9, asked for paper and a fountain pen, wrote something, sealed it, and went out. She didn't come back." Maigret closed the ledger gently. "Show me the room." The corridor smelled faintly of disinfectant and dust. The wallpaper was peeling in small, sorrowful curls. Room 17 was on the 3rd floor, facing the narrow alley where the rain collected in puddles that reflected nothing but the pale light of the opposite wall. The clerk unlocked the door and stepped aside. The room was small, modest, with a single iron bed, a washstand, and a wooden chair. A smell of faded perfume lingered faintly in the air, mixed with something metallic, perhaps the memory of smoke. Maigret entered, his gaze moving slowly from corner to corner. The curtains were drawn, the basin clean, the pillow dented in a shape that still seemed human. He sat on the edge of the bed. The springs complained softly. "Has anyone stayed here since?" "No, Chief. Not since the police from the local station came. They didn't take much. Only a few papers from the wastebasket." "Did they find a letter?" "Not that I saw." Maigret nodded absently. "Leave us." When the door closed, he removed his hat and drew the curtains open. The grey afternoon light seeped in like diluted milk. He lit his pipe, the small flame briefly colouring the walls, and began to look, not for objects but for absences. He'd learned long ago that rooms, like people, revealed themselves most in what they lacked. The table was bare except for a cigarette burn and the faint circle left by a glass. On the mantelpiece a single hairpin glinted, nothing special, yet deliberately placed. He touched it lightly, as though greeting a clue rather than discovering one. Janvier entered quietly, carrying a thin envelope. "Post office replied," he said. "They released the parcel from Saint-Quentin. It contained this." He handed it over. Inside were 2 pages, typewritten, unsigned. The first was a list of numbers and names, all male, all employees of the transport company that had burned in the explosion. The second was a short note, addressed simply, "To be delivered if anything happens to me." It read, "The papers they want are gone. Leclerc lied. Tell R to beware. I kept one copy, hidden where he'll never think to look." Maigret read it twice, slowly, before folding it back into the envelope. "She was trying to protect someone," he said. "But not Raymond. He was the decoy. It was Leclerc she feared, and yet she still met him." "She was brave," Janvier murmured. "Or tired," Maigret said. "Sometimes it's the same thing." He rose, pipe clenched between his teeth, and began pacing the narrow room. "A woman writes a confession and hides it. A man comes to retrieve it. She gives him something else. The parcel the widow saw, but it wasn't the letter, perhaps only copies. She fooled him for a few hours." He stopped by the window, and that was long enough for her to die. Janvier frowned. "You think he realized it later?" "Yes, probably that same night, maybe when he opened the parcel and found only blank paper. maybe when he went to the café and saw the police. Either way, he ran. But not far. Men like him never go far from where their pride was broken. He turned, scanning the room again. Something had begun to bother him. A small detail, like a whisper in the wrong place. His eyes moved toward the washstand. The porcelain jug was chipped, but the crack ran clean, recently. He lifted it. The base was wet. Inside the bowl lay a folded scrap of paper, damp but legible. He unfolded it carefully. The writing was faint, blurred by water. Room 17. If they find me, it's him. No name, just that single pronoun hanging like a ghost over the words. Janvier leaned over his shoulder. She must have written it after he left. Maigret didn't answer. His gaze lingered on the handwriting, hurried, unsteady, but deliberate. "Send this to the lab," he said finally. "I want to know what ink she used, what time it could have dried." He pocketed the note and looked around one last time. "She knew he'd come back," he murmured. "That's why she left the letter at the post office. She was planning for after she died, or in case she didn't." Outside, the sky was turning the color of pewter. The narrow alley glistened with puddles. Maigret stood at the window, watching a delivery boy struggle with a cart. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang, thin and sharp. He thought of Odette's last morning. The sound of her pen scratching against the paper, the slow movement of her hand as she sealed the envelope. How ordinary the act must have seemed, and how final it had become. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres that evening, the room felt close, the air heavy with the smell of rain-soaked coats. Lucas had returned from the Gare Saint-Lazare with a new report. "We found Leclerc's suitcase, Chief, hidden beneath a false bottom. Inside, a revolver, recently fired." Maigret didn't look up from the note he was rereading. "And fingerprints?" "His, only his." The inspector set the paper down and exhaled a slow breath. "He's growing desperate," he said. "He'll come back to Paris. Men like him always do. The city that knows their guilt is the only one that still feels like home." He crossed to the window. The Seine was invisible now, swallowed by the fog. Lights shimmered weakly along the embankment, as if even electricity had grown tired. "Postguards near the river and the stations," he said quietly. "And tell the press to print that we've found the weapon. Leclerc reads the papers. He'll take the bait." Janvier closed his notebook. "And when he does?" Maigret turned, his face unreadable behind the drifting smoke. "And my friend, we'll listen to his version of the truth. I want to hear how a man explains killing someone he once claimed to protect." The office fell silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like something alive. Maigret lit his pipe again, the small flame flaring briefly before dying into a steady glow. He thought of room 17, the damp note, the hairpin on the mantel, the faint smell of perfume lingering like unfinished music. A woman's room, he thought, was like her voice. It carried what she couldn't say aloud. And Odette, even in death, was still speaking. The night pressed close around the city, soft and thick with mist, the kind that swallows sound and turns even footsteps into secrets. The lamps along the quay were halos of trembling gold, their reflections drifting like broken constellations in the water. From the windows of the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret watched the river glide by, dark and unbothered, as if it had already carried away the truth. His pipe had gone out again. It always did when the case neared its end, as if the smoke refused to share the air with finality. He stood there long enough for the room behind him to cool. The papers on his desk rustled faintly in the draught. Then from the corridor came Janvier's voice, a soft knock, followed by a single word. "Chief!" Maigret didn't turn. "He's here, isn't he?" "Yes, Leclerc. They found him at the Gare de Lyon. He was trying to buy a ticket south." Maigret nodded once, slowly. "Bring him in." He remained at the window until he heard the footsteps, the door opening, the neat scrape of a chair. Only then did he turn. Leclerc sat at the table, his face grey, the collar of his coat limp and dark with sweat. The arrogance that had once filled his gestures, the easy smile, the musician's vanity, had drained away, leaving something smaller, more fragile. A man emptied of illusions. Maigret walked to the desk, set his hat down and leaned his heavy hands on the table. "You've been running a long time, Leclerc." The man's eyes flicked upward. "Running?" he repeated, a faint attempt at humour. "No, Chief Inspector, just walking away." "From what?" "From mistakes." Maigret struck a match and lit his pipe. The small flare lit both faces for an instant, the flame reflected in Leclerc's pupils before vanishing. "You were at the Hôtel Saint-Denis," Maigret said. "Room 17. You left before dawn. She stayed behind and wrote a note. Did you know she wrote it?" Leclerc's jaw moved once, stiffly. "I didn't know." "She wrote your name, or what's left of it?" "She wrote, if they find me, it's him." "That's not a lot of ink for a dying woman, but it was enough." The silence stretched. The only sound was the hum of the radiator and the distant echo of the river against the quay. Then Leclerc exhaled sharply, almost a laugh. "You think I killed her?" "I don't think," Maigret said. "I listen." "To what?" "To the way you breathe when you hear her name." Leclerc looked away. "You don't understand. None of you do. She wasn't what you think she was. Odette. She was frightened." "Not of me, not really. Of what we'd done, of what she couldn't forget." "What had you done?" The man hesitated, his fingers twitching on the tabletop. Then he spoke, voice low, as if confessing not to Maigret but to himself. "Saint-Quentin. It started there. We were smuggling. Not much, just documents, industrial papers. Everyone did it. But one night something went wrong. There was a fire. Laval, the accountant, he found out. He wanted money to keep quiet. I tried to scare him. I didn't mean to hurt him. The explosion wasn't planned. But after that, she couldn't bear it. She blamed herself for helping me hide the papers. She wanted to go to the police." "So you followed her to Paris?" "Yes," Leclerc said simply. "I thought I could make her see reason. We met at the Hôtel Saint-Denis. She said she'd written everything down, that she'd send it if I didn't leave her alone. She gave me a parcel. I thought it was the letter, but when I opened it, it was empty, just blank paper. She tricked me." "And then?" "I went back," Leclerc whispered. "That night, I waited outside the café. I wanted her to tell me where she'd hidden it. I swear I didn't plan anything. She came out, she saw me, we argued. She said she'd already sent the letter, that it was over. And then—" He stopped. His hands had begun to tremble. Maigret waited. "And then she tried to walk away. I grabbed her arm. She fell, that's all. I swear to you, Chief Inspector, I didn't strike her. She fell against the curb. It was raining. I remember the sound, not of her voice, of the rain hitting the stones." He covered his face with both hands. "When I touched her, she was still breathing. I didn't know she was dying." The inspector's expression didn't change. "And you left her there?" "Yes," he said into his palms. "I left her." Maigret tamped the ash from his pipe. "You've told this story before, haven't you? To yourself, maybe. A version where she slipped, where you didn't mean it, where guilt looks like bad luck." Leclerc looked up, anger flashing briefly in his eyes. "You think I wanted this? You think I wanted her dead?" "No," Maigret said softly. "You wanted her silent, The man's shoulders sagged. She would have destroyed me. She already did. For a moment the room seemed smaller, the air thicker. Outside a foghorn moaned along the river. Maigret leaned forward. "Where's the letter she wrote? The one she said she'd sent?" Leclerc hesitated. "I don't know." "You do." He looked away. "Maybe she posted it. Maybe she didn't. Maybe it was just a threat. Then why were you buying a ticket to Nice?" The question broke something. Leclerc's voice cracked. "Because someone in Nice wrote to me yesterday. Said they had what she'd hidden. Said if I didn't come, they'd send it to the papers." Maigret's eyes narrowed. "Who?" Leclerc hesitated again. "Raymond." Janvier, standing silently in the corner until now, took a step forward. "Raymond's still in custody, Chief. He hasn't sent anything." Maigret's gaze lingered on Leclerc. "Then someone's using his name. Someone who knows both of you." He straightened, the smoke from his pipe curling between them. "You'll sign your statement, Leclerc, and you'll stay here until morning. Maybe by then you'll remember where the real letter is." Leclerc said nothing. When the door closed behind him, the room felt abruptly larger, emptier. Janvier waited for a long moment before speaking. "You believe him?" Maigret exhaled. "Parts of him." He walked back to the window, staring out at the river. "There's always truth in fear. He didn't lie about that." "But the fall?" "No, a woman doesn't bruise like that from falling once." There were 2 blows. One before, one after. Janvier frowned. "You think he finished it?" "I think he panicked. And then tried to make the rain his accomplice." He turned from the window, his eyes tired but alive. "But there's still the letter. She said she hid it where he'd never think to look." "And where does a man like Leclerc never look, Janvier?" Janvier thought a moment. "Anywhere that reminds him of himself." "Exactly." Maigret's gaze drifted to the photograph on the desk. The one from Saint-Quentin, Odette smiling faintly beside the man who had killed her. He lifted it, studying the edges. Then he noticed something. The cardboard was thicker than it should be. Carefully he peeled back the backing. Between the 2 layers was a thin sheet of paper folded twice. He unfolded it slowly. Typed lines filled the page. A confession dated the day before Odette died. "If anything happens to me, it will be René Leclerc. He says he loves me, but he is afraid. Of what I know, of what he's done. I forgave him once. I cannot again." Maigret read it twice, then handed it to Janvier. "So she sent 1 copy to the post office," he said, softly, "and kept another hidden inside the photograph he'd never notice." He returned to the window. The fog had begun to lift slightly, revealing the faint lights of barges moving downstream. "Prepare the paperwork," he said quietly. "Charge him with murder. There'll be no appeal to passion here, only to cowardice." Janvier nodded and left the room. Maigret remained where he was, pipe between his fingers, staring out into the half-lit city. The mist was thinning, and for the first time in days he could see the opposite bank, the line of lamps stretching like a rosary across the dark water. He thought of Odette's handwriting, the small, uneven script of a woman who had tried to make truth outlast fear. And in a way, she had succeeded. Outside, the river moved on, carrying with it the faint echo of her final word. By dawn, the rain had settled into a steady whisper, the kind that Paris wears like a memory rather than weather. It polished the rooftops and blurred the lamps along the quay until the whole city seemed caught between sleep and remorse. In the offices of the Quai des Orfèvres, a kind of hush lingered, the hush that follows confession, when everything has been said and nothing truly explained. Leclerc had slept, or pretended to, on the narrow cot in the holding cell. Janvier stood watch for a while, then drifted back upstairs, yawning, his notes still damp from the mist that crept in through the open window. The case, it seemed, had come to rest, but rest, for Maigret, was never peace. He sat at his desk, coat draped over the back of the chair, a thin trail of pipe smoke curling lazily toward the ceiling. The photograph lay before him, its secret unfolded and catalogued, yet it still drew his eyes. In Odette's half-smile there was no triumph, no tragedy, only the quiet resignation of someone who had foreseen both. He turned it over once more, tracing the faint pencil marks that time hadn't erased. Saint-Quentin, July 1931. The radiator hissed faintly. A car horn drifted up from the embankment, lonely as a question. He thought of the chain of days that had brought him here, the flickering sign, the widow's lamp, the damp note in the washstand, the man who mistook guilt for love. The facts formed a clean line, but the truth, as always, refused to walk it. When Janvier entered, Maigret didn't look up. "The prosecutor's satisfied," the younger man said softly. "Leclerc will be charged formally by noon. They'll take him to Santé this afternoon." Maigret nodded. "He asked for anyone?" "No, he's quiet, like he's already somewhere else." For a while, neither spoke. The only sound was the tapping of rain against the window panes. Then Maigret said, almost to himself, "It never feels like justice, does it, Janvier? Only like an ending." Janvier smiled faintly. "An ending is all most people get." He left a moment later, his footsteps fading down the corridor. Maigret stayed seated, staring at the grey morning that pressed its reflection against the glass. The city looked washed clean, but he knew better. Paris never stayed clean for long. It just changed the colour of its dirt. At 9:30, he put on his hat and stepped outside. The river was swollen, the pavement slick beneath his shoes. He walked without destination, letting the city lead. It was a habit Madame Maigret never understood, that he preferred to think with his feet. The cafés were opening now, the smell of coffee and damp wool drifting through the doorways. Newsboys shouted the headlines, waving the morning edition. Pianist confesses to murder of barmaid. The story was already shrinking, its tragedy traded for a neat column of print. He stopped at a kiosk and bought a copy. Beneath the bold type was a photograph of Leclerc, taken years ago, smiling, hair glossy, unaware of the fate that would one day wear his name. Odette's name was smaller, buried halfway down the page. It was always that way. The living were given faces, the dead only footnotes. At a café near the Pont Saint-Michel, Maigret took a corner table and ordered coffee. The waitress, a young woman with a tired smile, poured it carefully, the steam rising like the last breath of the night. He thanked her and opened the newspaper again, though he wasn't reading. He was thinking of Madame Maigret, of the quiet breakfast she would be laying now, the warmth of domestic ritual untouched by crime. He thought of calling her, but didn't. What could he have said? That the rain had stopped? That justice had been done? Neither would have been true. Outside, a man with an accordion began to play. The melody was faint, wobbly, but familiar, a tune Maigret had heard somewhere in Montmartre the night the case began. The coincidence made him smile faintly, though without joy. He watched the passers-by hurry beneath their umbrellas, their reflections merging with the puddles. Paris was already forgetting. He finished his coffee and walked again, drawn by something like instinct. By late morning, he found himself back where it had all started, the Boulevard de Clichy. The Café des Deux Anges looked almost cheerful now, its windows steamed, its patrons noisy with late breakfasts and laughter. The neon sign above the door had been repaired. Its blue letters glowed steadily, no longer flickering. The rain had washed the blood from the cobblestones long ago. Maigret stood across the street for a long moment. A delivery boy brushed past him, muttering. A couple laughed beneath a shared umbrella. He crossed over and entered the café. The patron, the same man with the apron that never looked quite white, stiffened when he saw him. "Chief Inspector." "Morning." "You've caught him, then?" "Yes." The man nodded slowly, drying a glass that didn't need drying. "Good. The girls sleep easier now." Maigret said nothing. His eyes drifted to the table by the cigarette machine. It was occupied by a pair of young lovers whispering over coffee, oblivious to history. The girls' laughter was soft, almost apologetic. It was a sound he recognized. He ordered nothing, simply stood there for a moment, letting the smell of beer and tobacco wrap around him like an old coat. Every café in Paris had this smell, he thought. It was the scent of persistence, of lives continuing whether justice was served or not. As he turned to leave, the patron called after him, "You'll have a drink, Chief, for the end of it?" Maigret paused at the door. "No," he said gently. "It's not the kind of story you drink to." Outside, the rain had begun again, softer now, like a memory rehearsing itself. He lit his pipe under the awning and watched the smoke rise into the damp air. The repaired sign flickered briefly, almost imperceptibly, as if reminded of its former imperfection. Then it steadied. He began to walk back toward the river, coat collar turned up, shoes splashing through shallow puddles. Behind him the café door closed, and with it the last echo of the case. The sound of the city folded around him, the hiss of tires, the murmur of voices, the rain whispering against the rooftops. By the time he reached the bridge, the fog had begun to lift. The Seine moved below, grey and calm, carrying away the reflections of lamps and men alike. Maigret stopped at the parapet, resting his elbows on the stone, and let his eyes follow the current. Somewhere beneath that shifting surface, he thought, lay every secret Paris had ever buried. He knocked the ash from his pipe and stood there a moment longer, letting the rain wash the smoke from the air. Then he straightened his hat and turned toward home. Madame Maigret would be waiting with lunch, and he would sit by the stove, listening to the quiet rhythm of her movements, pretending that the world outside their walls was simpler than it was. Behind him, the river kept moving, indifferent and eternal. Above it, the rain continued its soft confession, falling on the city, on its guilty and its innocent alike. Each drop erasing a little of what had been, leaving only the sound of Paris breathing under the quiet rain.